Hey there, quick one. Here are 5 things to do before you start that podcast. Firstly, you must get a podcast name. Secondly, you must know your target audience. You must get a podcast niche. You must know the podcast format and your podcast about. So let's start with podcast name. Getting a podcast name can be very, very overwhelming. But first of all, you need to brainstorm widely. Play with words around your topic of interest, your area of interest. Secondly, consider your target audience. Look for words that appeal to them. Words that can be very, very appealing to them. So you need to consider your target audience. Thirdly, look for podcasts like names that are unique. You must be creative, you must be unique. It must be a unique name, a name that is not even trademark. So check online, do your research, look for existing podcasts that is going to be talking about areas of your own interest. So their names will guide you in getting your own podcast name. Now make sure that those names are your own names are going to be unique, because you don't want to be using a trademark name already. And then I'll always advise like 14 to 29 words maximum. It should be within that range when you're getting a podcast name. Then try to avoid the word podcast when you're getting a podcast name. You hear of a lot of podcasts now, The Honest Bunch, Tea with Tay, To My Sisters, with Chude. There are a lot of podcast episodes. So now try to avoid the name podcast. Now, secondly, how do you discover your podcast niche? Now, your podcast niche basically refers to the topic or area of interest that you want to specialize in or specialize on. So try to narrow it down. You want to be speaking on education, you want to talk on religion, you want to speak on politics. So now this will help guide the kind of topics that you get to put out there, and to also tailor the kind of content you put out there, tailor the kind of guests you bring on your show, and so on and so forth. Then your podcast about is basically like the introduction. What's your podcast about? Now, my podcast is basically a podcast that talks about the challenges that young people face, and we provide a pathway to self-development and improvement. So know your podcast about, like, basically an introduction. They say, oh, what's the podcast about? What can you say about it? Then what kind of podcast format do you want to use? We have the solo format, we have conversational format, we have the co-host conversational format. So solo format is basically like what I'm doing right now, just myself talking to you, hosting the whole episode. When we're talking about conversational podcast, you're having like a group of like more persons joining the conversation, like more than 2 persons basically. Then we're talking about co-host conversational, is more like I and the co-host discussing. Maybe if I want to bring like a guest in, it's optional. So discover those things, and then I think you're also good to go. Then your target audience. Know your target audience. What kind of people do you want to, put your content